Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We will start today in our Democracies at War lectures, the substantive analysis of the wars fought by Western liberal democracies since the end of the Cold War. The basic thesis or assumption put forward is that these democratic wars are constitutive of what we may call the dark side of a democratic peace. I said last week that the wars fought by Western liberal powers are politically or morally disturbing because they refute the self-image of democracies being peaceful or peace-loving countries, and also said that these wars are scientifically challenging because they belie the one and only major IR theory, liberalism, claiming or positing that liberal democracies are, or at least should be, as such, peace-prone. The idea that democracies promote peace is a claim put forward all at once by policymakers, by political thinkers or philosophers, and by contemporary international relations scholars. So let's have a look at them. Concerning policymakers, I would like you to listen to a quote taken from the so-called Lake or Clinton doctrine that was adopted by the Clinton administration after the end of the Cold War during the 90s in order to be America's new grand strategy, given that the Cold War had come to an end, given that there was no more USSR, the containment doctrine which had prevailed during the Cold War was no longer useful. And so the US, or the Clinton administration at least, was looking for a new grand strategy. Here then is the quote concerned. The successor to a doctrine of containment must be a strategy of enlargement. Enlargement of what? Enlargement, I quote, of the world's free community of market democracies. So political regime democracy, and regarding the economic system, market economy. Why should the US promote the triumph of market democracies? Well, the reason is the following one, I quote, to the extent that democracy and market economics hold a sway in other nations, our own nation, America, the US, will be more secure, prosperous, and influential. And the whole world will be more humane and peaceful. The addition of new democracies makes us more secure because democracies tend not to wage war on each other. They tend not to sponsor terrorism. They are more trustworthy in diplomacy. They do a better job of respecting the human rights of their own people. In this doctrine, in the preamble of the doctrine, Anthony Lake referred explicitly to Woodrow Wilson. These dynamics, I quote Anthony Lake, these dynamics lay at the heart of Woodrow Wilson's most profound insights. He understood that our security is shaped by the character of foreign regimes. And as a matter of fact, Woodrow Wilson indeed had put forward the idea that democracies are peace-loving countries. You may know that Woodrow Wilson had been elected as America's president on the promise to America remaining neutral in World War I, and he changed his mind in 1917. He decided that America should get involved in World War I in order to permit the British and the French to defeat the Central European empires, Germany and Austria-Hungary. And his justification was the following one. It was precisely based on the idea that a democracy had to prevail. This is his famous a speech known as Make the World Safe for Democracy, a speech. Listen to Woodrow Wilson, the world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. Why? Well, here's the argument. Self-governed nations do not fill their neighbor states with spies. They do not set the course of intrigue to have an opportunity to strike and to make conquest. Democracies do not conquer other conquerors. Such designs, such aggressive designs can be successfully worked out, according to Wilson, only under cover, where no one has the right to ask a question, where there is no public opinion, where there is no transparency. Plans of deception or aggression carried out from generation to generation can be worked out and kept from the light only within the privacy of courts or behind the carefully guarded confidences of a narrow and privileged class. Only in countries where a minority, privileged class, is ruling can such plans of aggression be adopted, because there is no public opinion likely to refuse such plans. This is happily impossible. There where public opinion prevails, there where public opinion commands, there where, I quote, public opinion insists upon full information concerning all the nation's affairs, there can be no such plans of aggression. And the last sentence in the code: a steadfast concert for peace can never be maintained except by a partnership of democratic nations. This is the reason why he proposed the League of Nations, which in his mind was supposed to be first and foremost composed by democracies for reasons due to notably the French and the British vision. This League of Nations did not emerge. The League of Nations that was created included all the nations, yes, all the major nations at that time, at least the winning nations of World War I, and the US itself refused to participate. You know that. So Wilson claims that democracies were peaceful, and he himself was influenced by the Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant, whom to some extent he rediscovered. Kant, who in the history of political thought was the first. In his Perpetual Peace sketch published in 1795, he was the first to establish a link between a state's domestic regime and its foreign policy. As a matter of fact, thinkers of the past refused to establish any kind of link between the domestic regime and the foreign policy behavior of a state. And when they did, they were somehow tempted to consider democracies to be at least as war-prone as non-democracies. This, for instance, was the case of Thucydides, who looked at Athens, the most democratic city-state of Greece in ancient times, and who ascribed the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War to democratic Athens' expansionist behavior or expansionist growth. Same is true for Machiavelli during the Italian Renaissance, who looked at the Roman Republic, who turned empire after defeating Carthage in the Mediterranean Sea. So democracies somehow are tempted to adopt warlike behavior. And the same was true for a contemporary of Immanuel Kant, one of the three American Federalists, Alexander Hamilton, who wrote those Federalist Papers that dealt with international politics and with America's foreign policy. This is what he wrote in Federalist number 6. Have republics, he asked the question, have republics in practice been less addicted to war than monarchies? The opposition between republics and monarchies nowadays, we could say, democracies and autocracies. Have republics in practice been less addicted to war than monarchies? Are not republics administered by men as well as monarchies? Are there not predilections, rivalries, and desires of unjust acquisitions that affect nations, people, citizens, as much as kings, monarchs, are not popular assemblies subject to the impulses of jealousy, avarice, and of other irregular and violent propensities? And by asking the question, he suggests the response, of course, yes, popular assemblies, that is to say, democratic regimes, are as often tempted to go to war as monarchies or autocratic regimes. These authors, of course, were basically inspired by a classical realist vision of human nature as such, characterized by a will to dominate, and therefore they did not believe in the possibility of democracies to be more peaceful than autocracies. So Kant then proposed the opposite claim, and of course this was due to his I share my screen. This was due to his basically liberal philosophy, political philosophy, at least in his Perpetual Peace essay. He started this essay by claiming that the existing state of nature among the then European nation states was synonymous with a state of war. He was witnessing the wars of the French Revolution, of course. But contrary to Hobbes, he considered that it was possible to get out of this state of war. The state of war was not a never-ending characteristic of international politics. Peace could be established if different conditions, he called them the definitive articles, as opposed to the preliminary articles of the perpetual peace. Some conditions had to be fulfilled, and the most important one, the first one that we are directly concerned by here is, I quote, according to Kant, the civil constitution of every state should be republican. In order for perpetual peace to have a chance to prevail, states should be republican. The term republican was used in order not to use the term democratic. At that time, democracy referred to ancient Greek direct democracy. In order to avoid any confusion, Kant, who was thinking of republic as a regime characterized by the separation of powers between the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary, Kant used the term republican. And according to him, republics were favorable to peace for the very simple reason that, by definition, in a republic, the governments depend, since they were elected by the majority of the citizens, they depend on the citizens' consent when they decide, when they consider war as an instrument of foreign policy. They have to obtain, in other words, the agreement of citizens. Now, citizens, this is typical of Kant's liberal philosophy, citizens are rational individuals, are rational, risk-averse individuals who would be foolish if they accepted to go to war, since they would have to bear the negative consequences. Kant calls these consequences the calamities of war. They would have to fight. The French had introduced the compulsory draft. We will see this in another chapter. They would have to pay the costs of war. That is to say, taxes would be raised, of course, in order to finance the war. They would have to repair the destructions that the war would leave behind. So citizens would refuse to permit their elected governments to go to war. The opposite is true for autocracies. By definition, a dictator makes fun of the citizens, who are actually not citizens but subjects, because they are submitted to the dictatorship, and therefore a dictator can decide to go to war on the most trivial reasons whenever they think that it is in their interests, or in their interest, or in their state's interest, to use violence on the international scene. This is Kant's original version of the democratic peace theory or philosophy. If then we compare like Wilson and Kant, we can conclude that there are implicitly or explicitly two versions of the democratic peace theory or of the peace proneness of democratic regimes. Chronologically speaking, Kant being the first, Kant proposes basically a monadic version of the democratic peace theory. That is to say, democracies are, as such, peaceful. The Republican Constitution, the first sentence in my quote, the Republican Constitution gives a favorable prospect for perpetual peace. As such, the Republican Constitution is favorable to peace. Wilson shares this idea when he says that, I quote, I already gave you this quote, self-governed nations do not fill their neighbors with spies. So as such, they do not look for going to war. They do not set the course of intrigue to have justification to conquer neighbors. So he shares the same monadic conception of democracies being inherently peaceful regimes. But he also says that a steadfast, the last sentence that I gave you, the last quote, a steadfast concept of peace can only be established among democracies, which amounts to saying that as long as there are non-democratic states, there can be no peace with these non-democratic states. To put it differently, he somehow anticipated what we may call a dyadic version of the democratic peace theory. That is to say, the fact that democracies are peaceful among one another and not necessarily when dealing with non-democracies. And this is also the idea which is at the core of the Lake or Clinton doctrine. The addition of new democracies makes us, America, more secure, I quote, because democracies tend not to wage war on each other. So democracies do not go to war against one another. This would be the dyadic version of the democratic peace theory. And maybe Clinton and Lake adopted this dyadic version because they knew that in the American discipline of international relations, this dyadic version of the democratic peace theory had become prevalent at the end of the 80s, at the beginning of the 90s, that is to say, some years before Clinton and Lake proposed their enlargement doctrine. So let's have a look at the discipline of international relations. Ladies and gentlemen, the idea that democracies are peaceful, at least when dealing with one another, goes back to the 80s for the very simple reason that before the 80s, the first IR scholars had put forward, when looking at the links between domestic regimes and the foreign policy behavior, the war or peace proneness of democratic regimes, those who had undertaken such researches had come to somehow contradictory conclusions. I mentioned Quincy Wright in my introduction, a study of war published during World War I. According to Quincy Wright, there is absolutely no positive link. This was his finding. There is absolutely no link, no positive link between democracy and peace and peaceful foreign policy. Listen to Quincy Wright. Statistical findings do not corroborate the idea that democracies have been less often involved in wars than non-democracies. Probably there are tendencies in favor of peace and war, both within democracies and within autocracies. So no link at all, according to Quincy Wright in 1942 or 1943, when he published his study of war. Things evolved and changed. For the first time, in the 1960s, when an American sociologist, Dean Babst, published an article called, whose title is Elective Governance, a Force for Peace. And in this short publication, Dean Babst claimed, I quote, "No war has ever been waged among independent nation states whose governments have been elected democratically. No war among democracies," first claim. And second claim, since there is a growing number of democracies, we'll come back to this, since there is a growing number of democracies, democracy is becoming a force for peace. This is the subtitle, A Force for Peace. This article was published in somehow regional academic journal, the Wisconsin Sociologist, which is anything but an IR journal. It is not part of the international relations discipline in America. So it did not immediately impact the discipline of international relations, but it was sufficiently challenging to incite some quantitative researchers to try to check empirically whether indeed there is a link between a state's democratic regime and its foreign policy behavior, and more specifically, whether there is a link between a democratic regime and its peace-prone behavior. So the first scholars who undertook this quantitative verification test were first Melvin Small and David Singer in their COW projects, Correlates of War project. They published an article in 1976, The War Proneness of Democratic Regimes. It's the last reference on the slide that you see. And the other author is Rudolf Rommel, who in 1983 published an article called Libertarianism and International Violence. This article had been preceded by other publications putting forward the same research. Rommel himself was at the head of a kind of alternative quantitative research program called Understanding International Conflict. So the two research programs came at opposite results, findings. David Singer and Melvin Small first, in their Correlates of War project. They looked at the different wars that were fought from 1815 to 1965, that is to say, a very significant time span of 150 years, which happened to include what they call, we saw this in the introduction, the extra systemic wars, that is to say, the wars fought, the colonial wars fought by Western powers when conquering overseas territories. And their conclusions were the following ones. And democracies have been involved in as many wars as non-democracies. The wars where democracies were involved were maybe less bloody, but they lasted longer than, on average, than wars which were fought exclusively by non-democratic states. Democratic states have as often initiated wars as they were victims of attack. And if indeed there are no examples of wars opposing democracies, this is due to the fact that democracies had no common borders. They were not neighboring states, to put it differently. To some extent, they therefore had no significant reason to go to war. There were no risks of territorial disputes, territorial quarrels, border quarrels between democracies. And they then come logically to the following conclusion: democracies have not been peace-prone. And during the studied period, non-elective governments autocratic governments do not monopolize aggressive and useless wars. This is their conclusion, David Singer and Melvin Small, cannot share the optimistic conclusion relative to the positive links between democracy and peace. There is no positive link between democracy and peace. This was Singer and Small's conclusion. The result found by Rudolf Rommel was exactly the opposite. In his research program, Understanding International Conflict, he analyzed international wars during the period, the very short one, 1976 to 1980. And he came to the conclusion that democracy is a peace-prone factor. Two general conclusions. When he uses the term libertarian regimes or states, he thinks of what we may call democracies. First conclusion, libertarian states mutually preclude violence, be they territorially contiguous neighbors or not. To put it differently, it's the same idea. Violence will occur between states among which at least one is non-libertarian or non-democratic. And the second conclusion that he drew, freedom inhibits violence. Freedom or democracy inhibits violence. The more libertarian the state, the less it tends to be involved in violence. So here we come back to some extent to the monadic version. A democratic state or libertarian state as such is likely to be peaceful. So let's then compare these two researches in order to try to get out of this dead end, since the findings are perfectly contradictory. The comparison was made by Steve Chan, the second reference on the slide. Mirror, mirror on the wall, are the freer countries more Pacific? And Steve Chan immediately permitted us to understand why the results were different, while the findings were opposite. This was due to the methodological choices made by the two research programs. Melvin Small and David Singer had a huge time period of 150 years, while Rommel focused on only 5 years. The period chosen by Small and Singer included colonial wars fought notably by major powers and major democratic powers, at least Republican powers, France and Great Britain, the Netherlands, etc. While, by definition, in the time period chosen by Rommel, 1976 to 1980, there were no more colonial wars. And it happens that 1976 happened to be the year following America's Vietnam War and America's Vietnam defeat. So if then we try to combine, this is what Steve Chan proposes, the two researches, the two methodological starting points, let's choose the time period from 1815 to 1980, so a large period in order to be statistically significant. And let's focus on international wars strictly defined as wars opposing independent sovereign units and no more sovereign ones to colonial territories, by definition not sovereign. If we do that, then the two researches to some extent are compatible. Why? Because Steve Chan draws the following conclusion, I quote, political freedom or political democracy or democratic regime erects a mutual barrier to violence between democracies. Democracies, to put it differently, do not go to war against one another. Two democratic, independent, sovereign states do not go to war against one another. However, political freedom, the second conclusion of Steve Chan, does not have the same effects when democracies are dealing with non-democracies. When democracies deal with non-democracies, there is no barrier to violence on behalf of democratic regimes. This was the conclusion drawn by Steve Chan at more or less at the same time. A second American author came to the same conclusion. This second American author is Michael Doyle, who published an article in a journal of political philosophy Ethics and International Affairs. It was republished in the collection published by Michael Brown, Debating the Democratic Peace, which was published in the midst of the 1960s. Michael Doyle's original article was named Kant, Liberal Legacies and Foreign Affairs. And he came to exactly to the same conclusion as Steve Chan on a more philosophical or qualitative basis. This is his conclusion. I quote, liberal states are different. They are different from non-liberal states. Why are they different? They are indeed peaceful, yet they are also prone to make war. They are indeed peaceful, yet they are also prone to make war. Liberal states have created a separate peace. There is a barrier to violence when they deal with one another. Republics or liberal states or democracies remain in a state of war with non-republics. There is no such barrier, to quote Steve Chan, when democracies deal with non-democracies. To put it differently, democracies are peaceful when dealing with one another. They are able to establish a separate zone of peace. All the other relations still take place within what realists would call a state of war. Democracies dealing with non-democracies and vice versa still go to war against one another. And this is all the more so true of non-democracies when they deal with one another. In a dyad of two, or more than two, non-democracies, war still regularly breaks out. So Doyle comes to the same conclusion, to the same empirical statement as Steve Chan, but he is eager to propose an explanation. Why do democracies behave differently when dealing with one another than when interacting with non-democratic states? And since he is eager, and since he manages to propose an explanation, he is considered as the founding father to some extent of the contemporary, the modern version of the democratic peace theory. His explanation directly refers to Kant, as indicated in the title, by the title of his article, Kant, Liberal Legacies and Foreign Affairs. And basically, if I should sum up his idea, it consists in saying that democracies do not go to war against one another because they all are based on the same principles, and more specifically, they do respect the basic human rights of their own populations. In doing so, he refers to Kant. I quote, liberal states have created a separate peace. They are capable of achieving peace among one another because, I quote, they exercise diplomatic caution and they are capable of appreciating the international rights of foreign republics. These international rights of foreign republics derive from the representation of foreign individuals who are our moral equals. That is to say, when there is a conflict in the strict meaning of divergent interests opposing two democracies, democracies can hardly explain to their own citizens whose rights they respect, that they go to war against another state which also respects the basic rights of its own individuals, these individuals which we consider to be our moral equals. That is to say, we cannot afford to interfere in the domestic affairs of other democracies since they share the same values, they are based on the same principles. There is a kind of we feeling, there's a kind of common identity which is shared by all the democracies. And the opposite is true when democracies are dealing with non-democracies. According to Michael Doyle, liberal republics remain in a state of war with non-republics. Why? The first reason, which he merely alludes to, and then he proposes the same explanation, the other side of the first explanation. Liberal republics first, and this is why they are in a state of war with non-republics, see themselves as being threatened by aggression by non-republics, since these non-republics are not constrained by representation. There is no impact of free, rational, risk-averse citizens, individuals upon the government, since the government is not representative. But he does not go further. We'll come back to this point. He prefers logically to emphasize the second explanation of why democracies go on sometimes fighting wars against non-democracies. And this is due to the fact that democracies are prepared to protect and promote, sometimes forcibly, sometimes by going to war. They are prepared to protect and promote democracy, private property, and the rights of individuals overseas. So democracies are tempted to promote the rights of citizens, the rights of individuals, the basic human rights overseas, in those non-republican states which, since they do not respect their own citizens, since they violate the basic human rights of their own population, these states, these non-republican states, do not have the right to non-interference. So according to Michael Doyle, liberal democracies are pretty often tempted to spread their values and to impose them upon non-democratic or non-liberal regimes accused of violating the basic human rights, which according to republics are universal and therefore have to be protected also in autocratic regimes. Michael Doyle's explanation, basically in terms of shared values, is complemented, we saw this 2 minutes ago, by the illusion, I quote again, that sometimes liberal republics see themselves as being threatened from aggression by non-republics that are not constrained by representation. And this second argument will be at the core of Bruce Rossett's explanation of democratic peace. Bruce Rossett, who published his major book, Grasping the Democratic Peace, 10 years after Lane's original article in 1993. And Bruce Rossett is an international relations scholar. He had been a student of Karl Deutsch, who's at the origin of the concept of security community, put forward in the 1950s. Bruce Rossett's version of democratic peace theory focuses on precisely the explanation which Doyle alludes to without deepening it, that is to say, the fact that democracies do not feel threatened by other democracies, but they feel insecure when dealing with non-democracies. Rosset starts his analysis with looking for the origins of the democratic peace. And he studied two crises that broke out, opposing two democracies, and that were resolved peacefully, thus to some extent introducing a kind of habit of democracies to privilege peaceful conflict resolution among themselves. And the two crises are the following ones. The first one that he analyzes is the Venezuela crisis, which took place at the end of the 19th century, 1895, 1896. The Venezuela crisis, which at the origin opposed Venezuela, a Latin American country, to Great Britain because of the British colony of British Guiana in South America, a neighbor. a territory, nowadays independent, but at that time, a British colonial territory. There was a kind of dispute border between the two, and there was a risk of a war between the UK, which at that time was the prevailing hegemonic power, and Venezuela, a weak Latin American country. Venezuela, what's more, and here's the link with democratic peace theory, Venezuela, of course, being too weak to resist a prospective attack by the British, appealed to the US in the name of the Monroe Doctrine. America, to the Americans, we do not interfere in Europe, but you Europeans will no longer interfere in America, in Latin America, or in the whole Western Hemisphere. By appealing to America, Venezuela introduced America in the conflict, and so there was a risk of a conflict, an armed conflict, a war opposing democratic UK to democratic US. So here there was a risk of a crisis escalating into a war opposing two democracies. This risk was avoided. A compromise was found between the British and the Americans. No war broke out. A peaceful resolution prevailed, and ever since then, the US-British relationship is known as the special relationship, the last war that the two powers fought goes back to more than 2 centuries in 1812, when Washington was burnt down by the British. And Rosset analyzes a second crisis which broke out 2 years later in Africa, 1893, the Fashoda crisis opposing two European democracies who happened at that time to be colonial powers, the British and the French, because they wanted to establish a kind of continuity in the African territory that they were conquering and dominating. The French from Senegal to Djibouti, west to east, and the British from Cairo to Cape Town, north to south. So to some extent, the two armies met in the region which nowadays corresponds to Sudan and Chad. Fashoda, there was a risk of the two armies going to war. This risk was avoided. A peaceful solution was found, and ever since then, the British-French relationship is characterized by the so-called Entente cordiale. So Rosset looks at these two incidents, at these two crises, and tries to understand why it was possible at that time for the countries concerned, the democracies concerned, to find peaceful solutions. And then he generalizes his explanation, his concrete explanation of the two cases into a general theory. This democratic peace version of Rosset puts forward two complementary explanations of why the democracies are peaceful with one another while still sometimes going to war against non-democracies. The first explanation, he calls it the normative or cultural explanation. That is to say, he emphasizes the role of values prevailing within a democracy, what he calls the culture of compromise. That is to say, in a democracy, by definition, a political conflicts are resolved peacefully. This is to say, in an election, those who lose the election accept their defeat. They do not stage a coup in order to prevent the winner from exerting government. Competition among political parties is peaceful. The economic conflicts, the social conflicts, etc., are resolved peacefully by negotiation, by compromise, by dialogue. When then a democracy is confronted to another democracy, it knows that this other democracy is compromise prone. The second democracy knows that the first democracy is compromise prone. The two know that the other ones know that they themselves are compromise prone, etc., etc. This is to say, both can afford to bet on compromise, on peaceful conflict resolution. And since war, we saw this in our introductory chapter, since war is rational only when used after the failure of diplomacy, if diplomacy is likely to resolve, there is no use, there is no reason to go to war. It would be costly, foolish, irrational to go to war. So war is no more an option to some extent, because democracies, when having a conflict, thanks to their culture of compromise, can bet on a peaceful conflict resolution. And logically, this is not true when a democracy is confronted to a non-democracy. There is no culture of compromise in dictatorship. So a democracy knows that it cannot bet on this other non-democratic states somehow, somewhat spontaneously resorting to conflict resolution. It cannot afford not to consider war as an option, and therefore sometimes wars do break out. It would be too risky to merely bet on the peaceful resolution. Therefore, war still remains an option, and sometimes the crisis escalates indeed to a war. First explanation, normative or a cultural. This explanation is complemented, supplemented by a second one, which Rosset calls the structural or institutional explanation, which is somehow close to Kant's original one. This second explanation, the institutional one, or the structural explanation, underlines, emphasizes the role of institutional constraints that characterize a democratic decision-making process. When a democratic state is committed in a conflict, whoever the other state concerned, whatever the other state's regime, the government who considers, should I go to war or not, it cannot go to war by surprise. It cannot decide suddenly to go to war. Why? Because it must convince the public opinion. It must convince those critical voices, notably in the media, who disagree with the perspective of war. It must convince the majority of members of parliament, because they will have to vote, notably the taxes that have to be increased in order to finance the war. To put it differently, there can be no decision to go to war by surprise. And once again, then, the same is true in another democracy, when the conflict opposes two democracies. To put it differently, once again, there is significant time period separating the point in time t when a democratic state is considering war as an option, and the point in time t plus 1, plus 2, plus 3, when the prospective war may break out. This time span then is an opportunity, is used as an opportunity for the two democracies to look for peaceful resolution. They can bet on diplomatic resolution because they know that there will be no attack by surprise on behalf of the other democracy, since the other democracy too is constrained by the same institutional constraints. So no risk of a kind of war by surprise. And here again, the opposite is true. When a democracy deals with a non-democracy, a dictatorship by definition does not permit critical journalists to express their point of view. Critical journalists are jailed or expelled and sometimes killed. There is no public opinion worth this name. The members of the parliament are not do not constitute a real opposition to the dictator. So it would be dangerous for a democratic government, according to Rosset, to bet on a peaceful conflict resolution. There is a risk of a surprise attack by the dictatorship concerned, because there are no constraints on this dictatorship resorting to violence, and therefore sometimes wars break out, opposing democracies to non-democracies, and all the more so non-democracies among one another, because by definition, in a dyad of two non-democratic states, no one of the two has institutional constraints which limit his freedom of action. If then we combine Bruce Rossett's complementary explanations, and we add them to Doyle's explanation. The democratic peace theory, contemporary democratic peace theory, consists in one claim and in two explanations. One claim is that democracies are peaceful among one another, which means that they are not peaceful when dealing with non-democracies. And two explanations: they are peaceful with one another, either because of the values they share, or because of, in their mutual interaction, there is no more security dilemma. That is to say, the mutual peaceful expectation due to the shared values and to the constitutional or institutional constraints puts the security dilemma between brackets. There is no more perception of the risk of being attacked, and therefore diplomacy is likely to prevail. The opposite is true when democracies deal with non-democracies, where there is no such mutually shared peaceful expectation and when there is no shared values, of course. The democratic peace theory, I would say from the beginning of the 90s onwards, had a huge success in the discipline of international relations. The context contributes to explain this. The end of the Cold War had been peaceful, and this, of course, to some extent refuted the realist or even the neo-realist pessimistic outlook of a never-ending state of war, the risk of war between the US and the USSR because of their power rivalry. Liberalism was triumphant as a democratic regime. The third wave of democratization somehow proved this empirically. And as a theory, the democratic peace theory is very elegant and very parsimonious. Parsimonious. A theory is a theory likely to explain many processes, many dependent variables by one major independent variable. And here the independent variable is the presence or not of democratic regimes. As usual, ladies and gentlemen, a successful theory raises jealousies or criticisms. So the democratic peace theory provoked the outbreak of different criticisms. A first set of criticisms was put forward by realist scholars, and chronologically speaking, a second set of criticisms was put forward by more critical or radical scholars. The realists, if I should sum up before going into the details, the realists criticized both the empirical statements of the existence of democratic peace or they criticized the explanation of democratic peace as being due to the democratic regime. And radicals accepted the idea that democracies do not go to war against one another, but they emphasized precisely what they called the dark side of democratic peace. That is to say, the fact that this democratic peace theory was instrumentalized, I think we can use this term, by Western politicians to somehow justify the wars that they were fighting, the ones that we are interested in. So let's have a look first at the realist criticisms. Realists first call into question the empirical claim according to which there is a separate zone of peace among democracies. To put it differently, they ask the question, are there wars opposing democracies which the democratic peace theorists neglected to some extent? The examples concerned are not covered actions. Covered actions, which are actions undertaken by democratic regimes to undermine other democratic regimes, because these other regimes are not considered to be compatible with the first democratic state's national interests. Covert actions, by definition, do not cause the death of 1,000 battle-related victims, and therefore they are not taken into account in statistical inquiries, which are at the empirical basis of our own analysis. Here, the example is the CIA intervening, notably in Chile, against the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende in 1973. A coup was staged by the CIA with Pinochet, a member of the Chilean army, with ITT, an American multinational firm. But this covert action is not a direct war, strictly defined. So it is not at covert actions that these realist thinkers are thinking of. They are thinking of a very concrete example. The first example they are thinking of is the example of Finland. Finland, which was a democracy during World War II, but which happened to be opposed to the democratic camp composed by the US and the UK, who were fighting against Germany. The problem with this democratic camp is that the USSR was an ally of the Americans and the British. Now the USSR had attacked Finland immediately after Hitler's attack against Poland during the winter of 1939. So Finland, as a democracy, had been attacked by the totalitarian communist regime of the USSR. And when then, after Hitler's invasion of the USSR became an ally of the US, Finland, being opposed to the USSR, was not in the camp of the democracies. So to some extent, there was a war, a state of war, opposing the democratic UK and the US to Finland, which was not a democracy. So the example is, however, too specific, too exceptional to be taken seriously. Why? Because concretely, not one single Finnish soldier was killed by an American or British one, or vice versa. There were no oppositions between armed opposition between the Finnish army and American or the British army. That is to say, the context was so specific due to the coalitions that this example hardly refutes the empirical statement of the democratic peace theory. There is a second example which is sometimes put forward: Germany. Germany during World War I. Why? Because it was opposed to France and the UK, which were democracies. Germany had been, and this is somehow significant or ironic, it had been considered in Woodrow Wilson's lectures when he was a professor at Princeton, before becoming president. He was professor of political science, had been presented as a democratic state. Before he himself declared war to Imperial Germany, considered to be autocratic. In his lectures as a professor, he had designated Germany as a democracy, but he had considered Germany as a democracy because of its social laws, which at that time indeed were by far the most progressive laws in Europe due to the importance of the then Social Democratic Party, the huge working class in Germany, which had managed to obtain some social laws which had no equivalent neither in the UK or although less so in the US or in France. So Germany at that time was a democracy regarding its social legislation, but regarding the decision-making process, I think we can say that it was the typical example of what Wilson himself called old diplomacy, secret diplomacy. The emperor decided together with his advisors, and his advisors were all members of the aristocratic class of the Prussian landowners, the Junkers, who were able to go to war, and William II himself was able to go to war. So the decision-making process regarding should we go or not to war in Imperial Germany was anything but democratic. So this example does not either refute the validity of the democratic peace's empirical statement. However, it raises another question, this example. What do we mean by democracy? When we talk of democratic peace, well, the response is somehow easy to make. In order for a democracy to be peaceful with another democracy, the two democracies concerned must be consolidated democracies, mature democracies, that is to say, characterized by the different institutions and by the individual rights that I summed up last week when I qualitatively defined a democracy, which also means that if the democracies must be consolidated democracies, this means that the transition period after the end of the dictatorship and during the first years of democratic regimes, this transition period is a kind of ambiguous context. The question was asked by Edward Mansfield and Jack Snyder in their book, which had been preceded by an article called Electing to Fight, Why Emerging Democracies Go to War. Mansfield and Snyder notably focused on what happened in the former Yugoslavia, when the new states, the successor states of Yugoslavia, Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, etc., Bosnia, after having been part of the communist Yugoslavia, became democratically elected, became independent and had democratically elected governments. However, wars broke out between the Serbs and the Bosnians and the Croatians. Well, by definition, they were not consolidated democracies since they were in the transition period. And to some extent, these wars can be considered as a diversionary wars, that is to say, given the difficulties that these governments had to live up to the democratic and economic expectations of their populations, they diverted, or they were tempted to divert their public opinions by designating an enemy, the Croatians or the Bosnians, for the Serbs for the Croatians and the Bosnians. So if indeed democracies in transition may be tempted to go to war, once consolidated, the democratic peace theory is corroborated by empirical reality. So the various empirical criticisms can hardly refute the established, I would say, fact. Democracies do mature, or consolidated democracies do not go to war against one another. Therefore, some other realists looked for other criticisms by definition. And they came to the conclusion that, yes, democracies do not go to war against one another, but no, it is not due to their democratic nature. That is to say, there are other, more important factors or variables that explain why they do not go to war. And the first author, the first realist, theorist who put forward this idea was Christopher Lane, who went back to Rosset's examples of the Venezuela and the Venezuelan crisis, and who added two other crises, the Trent affair and the Ruhr crisis in Germany. The Trent affair, ladies and gentlemen, is named after a British ship, the Trent, who had been stopped during the American Civil War in 1861, who had been stopped by the US Navy. And the US Navy found on this British ship two Southern American, those who wanted to secede from the US, two envoys, two Confederate envoys. So there was a risk of Lincoln accusing Great Britain to be an ally, to some extent, of the Southern states, since the British ship accepted Confederate envoys. There was a risk of a war opposing the US and the UK, and the Ruhr crisis, the German Ruhr crisis, broke out in the 1920s when France and also Belgium occupied the German Ruhr in order to force Germany to pay its war reparations, which the Germans were unable to pay because of the economic crisis. There was a risk of a war breaking out between France, a republic or a democracy, a third republic, and the German Weimar Republic, a democratic regime separating the Imperial Germany from Nazi Germany in the 1930s. So Christopher Lane has a look at these four crises, the two original ones of Rossett's and the two that he adds. And what did he see when looking at historical archives? He saw that actually during the crisis, many politicians in the countries concerned, the media all the more so, were anything but peace pro. They were bellicose. And they wanted that France should go to war, or that Germany should go to war against France in order to expel the occupation troops in the Ruhr. He saw that in England and also in the US during the American Civil War, many people would have preferred an armed confrontation rather than a peaceful conflict resolution. And so he comes to the conclusion, Christopher Lane, that though indeed no war broke out during these crises opposing democracies to one another, this absence of any war was due to classical power considerations. That is to say, Great Britain did not go to war against the US, neither during the Civil War nor during the Venezuelan crisis, because it was afraid of Germany profiting from a prospective US-UK confrontation to increase its own influence. The same was true for Great Britain opposed to France in Africa during the Fashoda crisis. Germany would have profited from this rivalry between the two other colonial powers, and regarding the Weimar Republic against France, Germany was too weak in 1923 to expel militarily the French troops from the region of the Ruhr in Western Germany. So all in all, according to the realist theorist Christopher Lane, the democratic peace, the absence of war among democracies, actually is due to the power configuration among the democratic states, which actually should be considered as powers among other powers. And a comparative argument is put forward by Henry Farber and Joanna Gower, who look at the absence of wars opposing democracies since notably World War II, and since their analysis was published in 1997, during the Cold War. No war opposing democracies during the Cold War, but the explanation is the following one. Well, of course, there is no war among democracies, but the peace among democracies is due to the fact that they were all confronted to the same common enemy, the Soviet threat. And what's more, within the democratic camp, the US as hegemonic power, to some extent, prevented any risk of war breaking out between the French, the British, the Germans, and had been the case in the past, because the US needed these European allies in its rivalry against the USSR. The same is true with Japan, of course. So basically, once again, it's the overall systemic power configuration which explains the absence of wars among democracies. It is not the fact that democracies are democracies which explains why they do not go to war against one another. What can we think, ladies and gentlemen? What do I think? Feel free to think of these criticisms. It's impossible to remake history, of course. So the only thing we can do is to to compare the theoretical explanations put forward. The problem with the realist explanation is that it's the balance of power theory as regards Lane. It's the power cycle theory for what concerns Farmer and Gower, the US hegemon, imposes its will upon the other members of the Western camp. What we can say is that according to the balance of power theory, states, whatever their regime, should balance one another. The problem, however, is that never did Western democracies join opposite alliances. That is to say, if we take the very concrete example of World War I, the US, the UK, and France, and later the US were in the same camp. Though at that time, the UK was prevailing, at least it was perceived to be prevailing. And according to the balance of power theory, France should not have bandwagoned with the UK. In 1945, since the US by far was the most powerful state, France, England, or the UK should have balanced against the US. They actually bandwagoned with the US, and the same is true since the end of the Colonial War. So the balance of power theory is rejected. The power cycle theory is refuted. The power cycle theory, to some extent, is corroborated. But the power cycle theory is not corroborated regarding the interwar period, when there was no somehow explicit hegemonic power because of the decline of the UK. And yet at that time, France never dared to challenge the UK, nor did the US. They remained allies, which tends to indicate that the fact that they were democracies is better explanation of their remaining allies than the fact that they had common enemies. Or if they had common enemies, it is the fact that these common enemies were not democracies, which explains why they remained themselves allies as democracies, to put it differently. In other words, the democratic peace theory provides a better explanation of why democracies do not go to war against one another. So I personally do accept both the empirical statement, democracies do not go to war, and the explanation, democracies do not go to war against one another, precisely because they are democratic. So the democratic peace theory, if you accept my conclusion, is a relevant one. But, and here then comes the radical critique, critical critique, radical but not post-positivist. In sometimes radical theories are associated to post-positivist theories. It's not my case. I think that given that the democratic peace theory indeed is a relevant one, well, it may become politically dangerous. That is to say, there is a risk of this theory to be used and actually to be instrumentalized by Western politicians. If democracies do not go to war against one another, the more democracies, the more peace, by definition. If then we want peace to prevail, well, we have to put an end to autocracies. And to put an end to autocracies, maybe we have to go to war. To put it differently, the pervert lesson drawn by politicians of at the origin academic democratic peace theory consists in saying we have to go to war in the name of peace, because by transforming dictatorships into democracies, we will favor peace. This is the hypothesis put forward by radical critiques, which I share in my analysis. So radicals first do accept the empirical statement that there are no examples of democracies going to war against non-democracies. And indeed, this empirical statement is corroborated first during the Cold War. If we look at the list of international wars strictly defined during the Cold War period, what do we see? We see that there are 25 wars, and three of them, in three of them, major Western liberal powers were involved. The Korean War in 1950, 1953, the Vietnam War, of course, the US, and the Falklands War called Malvinas by the Argentinians opposing Margaret Thatcher's UK to Argentina. Three times we have democracies at war against non-democracies. The US versus North Korea, the communist regime of Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung was his name. The Vietnam War, the US opposed to communist North Vietnam and the Vietnamese guerrilla in South Vietnam. And Great Britain opposed to Argentina of the military, junta of the military dictatorship, which characterized the Argentine regime from 76 to 82. It's the defeat to 83. It's the defeat of Argentina, which put an end, at least indirectly, to the military regime of Argentina in 1982, 1983. So the Cold War corroborates the empirical statement. The same is true for the post-Cold War. We already saw this list. When we look at the 19 or 20, depending on whether we consider the two wars opposing Azerbaijan to Armenia as one single war, or as two wars, since the first one occurred 18 or 19 years ago, and the second one less than 2 years ago in 2020. Anyway, out of these 19 or 20 wars, 7 are characterized by the presence of Western liberal democracies or Western liberal powers. The Gulf War of 1990, 1991, Iraq first invades Kuwait, which appeals to the UN, which adopts a resolution permitting first the US to launch its Operation Desert Shield. American troops were deployed in the Saudi Arabian desert to prevent any further prospective expansion of Iraq, and then the military operation itself, Operation Desert Storm, from the midst of January to the end of February in 1991. The US opposed to autocratic Iraq. Second example, Bosnia, 1995, NATO intervened once again on the basis of a UN resolution against Serbia. Serbia had a democratically elected government since, given the end of the communist regime. Milosevic was the leader, but obviously, if he was elected democratically, he did not respect the rights of the minorities, or at least those minorities that were eager to leave, to no longer be part of former Yugoslavia, in this case, Bosnia. Third example, the War of Kosovo, 1999, once again in former Yugoslavia. NATO once again opposed to Serbia, accused of practicing ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, which still was at that time a Serbian territory, but which wanted to become independent, which it managed to do in 1999 after NATO's military intervention. War number 4, after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, Operation Enduring Freedom, launched by the US and some of its allies. It was a coalition of the willing against Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden, the terrorist network who had staged these attacks, and they were harbored, they were protected by the Taliban regime. So the war was fought against the Afghan regime. War number 5, Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. Once again, George W. Bush, the son against Saddam Hussein. Operation Iraqi Freedom 2003. The US, democratic state, against the autocratic regime of Saddam Hussein. 2011, Operation Unified Protector, first launched by France and Great Britain on the basis of a UN resolution against Gaddafi, guilty of likely to massacre a significant part of Libya's population during the Libyan episode of the Arab Spring. France and Great Britain were joined by the whole NATO after some 2 weeks or so. That's to say, the US, two, once again, democratic liberal nations against the autocratic regime of Gaddafi's Libya. And last but not least, in 2014, the US, the UK, and France decided to intervene against ISIS, the Islamic State, in Iraq and notably in Syria, a war which is indirectly going on. At least there are still special forces of the 3 democracies concerned at present in Syria and then Iraq. Once again, democratic nations against non-democratic actors, ISIS being a network and not a state strictly defined. So the ladder of the democratic peace theory is not refuted, is not contradicted, but I feel free to say that the spirit of democratic peace theory is belied. Why? Because in the democratic peace theory, the wars that still exist opposing democracies to non-democracy, these wars somehow, implicitly or explicitly, are considered to be a kind of residual category. Why? Because the underlying assumption that the number of democracies is steadily growing. And since the number of democracies is steadily growing, logically, the number of wars fought by democracies against non-democracies, for the reasons that we saw, thanks to Doyle's and Rossett's explanations, the number of these wars should be diminishing too. And actually, the opposite is true. There are, during the post-Cold War period, many more wars in absolute and in relative terms than during the Cold War period. 3 out of 25 during the Cold War to be compared to 7 out of 19 or 20. So the liberal or democratic peace has a dark side, which is at least as significant as the positive side of democratic peace, the fact that democracies do not go to war against one another. If there are that many wars of democracies fighting against non-democracies, we can hardly satisfy with focusing on the absence, or at least it's not neutral, and to focus on the absence of wars among democracies rather than to emphasize the persistence and actually the increasing number of wars fought by democracies against non-democracies. Doyle, in his original article, emphasized the fact that the number of democracies were growing. There were 3 democracies at the end of the 18th century, 8 in 1850, 13 at the end of the 19th century, 29 after World War II. There were 50 when he wrote this article at the beginning of the 80s. There are nowadays 83 states or territories, according to the Freedom House findings, 83 territories out of 200 or so. So a bit more than 40% of nowadays political units are democratic units. So democratic states are more and more numerous. So logically, there should be less democratic wars against non-democracies, and actually the opposite is true. So this reality constitutes what we may call the dark side. All the more so, this is what we saw in our introductory chapter, there is a tendency of international wars in general to decrease. So international wars in general do decrease. The number of democracies increases, and yet there is a significant increase of democratic wars fought against non-democracies. This deserves an explanation, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm not sure that Russet's explanations are the good ones. According to Russet, if democracies do not go to war against one another, it is because there is no more security dilemma. They feel safe when dealing with one another, which means that they do not feel safe when dealing with non-democracies. To put it differently, basically, according to Russet, wars fought by democracies against non-democracies are due to security reasons. If then we look at our 7 post-Cold War wars, what do we see? We do not see many of these wars that can be explained by the perception of insecurity felt by democracies. Very quickly, the Gulf War, Iraq invaded Kuwait, the Western major powers' security was not immediately at stake, but we may say that, well, given the risk for the oil market, etc., there is an indirect link with the security or the stability of the oil market, and therefore of the economic richness, and therefore, why not, of the economic security somehow. But in Bosnia, nor in Bosnia, neither in Bosnia, nor in Kosovo, the security of the US, the UK, or France was at stake. Absolutely not. 2001, the terrorist attacks, indeed, America's security was at stake. So here, it's probably the war which somehow fits best Russet's explanation. Operation Iraqi Freedom, the argument of weapons of mass destruction, was put forward by George Bush, was the valid one. The question deserves to be asked, and we will see it next week. Operation Unified Protector in Libya, the Western security was anything but at stake. So here, the security argument cannot be put forward. And regarding the last of our 7 wars, the intervention against ISIS, some terrorist attacks had already taken place, other ones occurred after the intervention in September 2014 in Iraq and Syria against ISIS. So the empirical record is somehow mixed. We will see the links between military interventions and terrorism in our last chapter, in our chapter 11. So what is beyond doubt, I think, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that we cannot ascribe Western democratic wars against non-democratic states in the post-Cold War period. We cannot ascribe them to the security dilemma, to the insecurity felt, at least not in general, to the insecurity felt by Western liberal democracies. We therefore have to look for other explanations. We will see these other explanations in our next chapters, starting next week, ladies and gentlemen, with a detailed analysis of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Thank you very much for attending today's class. I hope to see you again next week. Have a great day. Goodbye.